It is no secret that the earth is getting hot. Each day we don't take any action, we make the planet uninhabitable for our children. To ensure that the balance does not tilt away from humanity, world leaders recently met in Glasgow to discuss climate change mitigation strategies. India too, under the leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, announced its ambition to become a carbon neutral economy by the year 2070.
Hello and welcome to our special series, ReNew Power presents Pathway to a Fossil-Free India, partnered by ET Now. Now, we've just concluded the COP26 summit, and after much consideration, India announced its net zero ambition along with a host of other short-term measures. Now, over the next 5 episodes, we'll bring you guests from India and abroad who will share their insights on what India's targets mean for the world, for the Indian renewable energy industry, and most importantly, for us citizens. Today, in the inaugural episode of the series, I have with me Dr. Ajay Mathur. He's the Director General of the International Solar Alliance. And we also have Mr. Sumant, Sinha, Chairman and CEO of ReNew Power. He'll be with us for all the 5 episodes. And we have a special guest in the second segment. We'll have Mr. Varun Sivaram, Senior Director for Clean Energy and Innovation, and also a US Climate Envoy at John Kerry's office. He'll be joining us in the second segment. So right now, let's kick off this discussion with Dr. Mathur and Mr. Sinha. Mr. Sinha, first up to you. India announced its commitment to net zero by 2070, and it's both been praised for it and also attracted a lot of criticism for it. Can you contextualize this goal for our viewers and tell us if the criticism or the praise is justified?
Look, on the one hand, I think it's very commendable that India actually, for the first time ever, put a net zero target on the table. And I don't think it was widely expected that India would do that. So I think it was a significant step forward from India's standpoint in actually acquiescing to even consider having that kind of a target. But on the flip side, 2070 is quite far away. It is 50 years away from now. And therefore, in some ways, does lend itself to questions around, is this really a very credible target? And so therefore, you have people from both camps, on the one hand praising it, on the other hand also criticizing it. I think net-net, it's a positive. Hopefully, as technologies evolve over time and as India continues to make progress on cleaning up our energy supply systems, and our economy becomes more accepting of carbon-free sources of generation of energy, as well as other technologies that allow us to take carbon out. As all of those technologies develop and as the costs of all of these mature, then over time it perhaps will become easier for us to meet that target sooner than later. And so I'm actually very hopeful that instead of 2070, which is really in some ways, I would say, the starting point of this conversation, I would be hopeful that we'll actually end up getting there earlier.
Right. Dr. Mathur, what should be the key takeaways for various stakeholders from the summit, for governments, for private sector, and for NGOs?
There was a huge amount of effort by countries, by companies to get together and start initiatives which see how we can reduce our carbon emissions. This was important because these coalitions told us that countries and companies are willing to take action. Here are some things on the table. Some countries, some companies are getting together to start it, but they are inclusive. More people can join in as we learn, as costs come down. This was an amazingly important issue. It was far more important than the discussions that were happening inside the negotiating rooms. This was number one. The second was that at the end of the day, COP26 brought into focus the need for accelerated action. And so, for example, in my area, solar, we saw a huge amount of emphasis on what countries and companies are doing in the solar area in order to move ahead. So to me, COP26 was actually the starting point, the rallying point for global cooperation on actions to reduce climate change.
Mr. Sinha, let's take this ahead. At the summit, we did not see any significant commitment to climate finance from rich countries. So what does that leave the poor countries with, and how will the demand for climate finance be met?
I think, Sumit, what's actually happening is that the whole, as Dr. Mathur said, the world is coming together in all sorts of incredible ways to move forward on dealing with climate change. And I think it's really moving much beyond governments and what governments agree among themselves. I think what is much, much more important now is actually what is the behavior of financial institutions and investors globally, because they control many, many hundreds of trillions of dollars of capital. And even a small change in their stance on moving some of their capital towards the climate change bucket will have an enormous significance, and much more than what any countries might get together and be able to do. Having said that, I would say that it is very important for multilaterals and some of the Western countries, which have in fact done more of the pollution, to actually start allocating some money for things which are really, which allow private capital to come in, even, which leverages private capital a lot better. So I think, look, there will be a lot of money coming in eventually, but it could have been enhanced if in fact the Western world, through the multilateral organizations, was a little bit more proactive. So I think, yes, it does impact climate financing, but I think even without that, financing will continue to happen.
Dr. Mathur, India announced the One Sun, One World, One Grid initiative at the summit. Does that bring India at the center table for any global climate policy?
What it is saying is that, listen, solar availability is an issue. It could be an issue in small countries, for example, Singapore. It is also an issue when night occurs and solar is not available. What do you do at that time? Consequently, we need batteries, but we also need connections between various countries so that solar electricity, for example, from Australia can flow to Singapore, or from Africa can flow to Europe. But at the same time, it can also flow from India to East Asia when it is dark in East Asia and is still light in India. It can flow from the Gulf region to India when it is dark in India and light in Gulf countries. So what it does is it puts a completely new solution, a new arrow in our quiver of solutions on the table.
Mr. Sinha, let's take that ahead because, on the policy front, India has taken several measures to promote clean energy and is now transitioning to innovative constructs such as round-the-clock renewable energy, etc. Now, which means that we are now evolving to address intermittency. How do you think the sector evolves from here on with the world's largest storage tender and also the National Hydrogen Mission? What are your thoughts?
Just given the scale of the needs of India, because keep in mind that India not just is right now already the third largest power market in the world, but we're actually growing at the fastest clip also. We're growing at 5 to 6% a year. And it's instructive to note that now we're almost 7 to 8% higher than our pre-COVID power demand. So power demand has rebounded very robustly. And so therefore, there will continue to be significant growth in India over the next many years. And therefore, over the, various studies have shown that power demand of the global power demand, incremental power demand, almost a quarter of that is going to come from India. And that's a remarkable statistic actually, which means what? Which means that to solve India's energy requirements more broadly, because electrification will keep going up, we actually need a solutioning that is including of all of the above, right? So we need more renewable energy. We need more round-the-clock renewable energy because clearly intermittency is a problem. You can have only so much solar because solar peaks in the daytime and goes away at night.
Dr. Mathur, what in your view are the key challenges and opportunities for a fair and inclusive global energy transition?
Sumit, there are two key challenges here. The first is that every country in the world should be able to solarize. As the Solar Alliance, we are working in a very large number of countries to develop solar projects, something of the order of 5.2 gigawatts worth of solar projects. The greatest challenge that we see there is that money is not flowing. And if it is flowing, it's at very high interest rates. So as Sumant said earlier, it is important that we have risk mitigation measures, the kinds he talked about. In some countries, it may be a guarantee mechanism. In other countries, it may be a hedging risk. But these are essential if we want money to flow.
Mr. Sinha, overseas, we've seen offshore wind gain momentum. Europe, for example, has big investments in offshore. Do you think that is possible in India? And what, according to you, are the positives and the challenges that can affect the growth?
Well, offshore wind is a lot more expensive, unfortunately, than onshore wind is. Even in European countries, But there they have an issue about not in my backyard concept, plus cost of land is also more expensive. So they really did not have a choice. They had to move offshore. Plus wind speeds are also better offshore. In India, unfortunately, the difference in wind speeds between offshore and onshore is not that much, and the cost is a lot higher. So, as a result of the higher cost of offshore wind, therefore, we've not really had a start of that whole opportunity. Having said that, my feeling is that as we continue to go forward, over the next 5 to 7 years, as more and more of the onshore wind sites get used up, we will need to have the development of an offshore wind sector as well. So I think it'll be great if the government starts that process sooner than later, because setting up the first projects will take 3 to 4 years. And then, that will also then start breaking down the cost. And over a period of time, I think it'll be a good addition to India's overall clean energy mix to have offshore wind.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Sinha and Dr. Mathur, for that insightful discussion. This is ReNew Power Presents Pathway to a Fossil-Free India, partnered by ET Now. But don't go anywhere. On the other side, Mr. Sinha will continue the episode in a special conversation with Mr. Varun Sivaram. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Welcome back to ReNew Power Presents Pathway to a Fossil-Free India, partnered by ET Now. We are in a special conversation now. We'll have Mr. Sumant Sinha. He's the chairman and CEO of ReNew Power, and he's in conversation with Mr. Varun Sivaram,
who is Senior Director for Clean Energy and Innovation, U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate at John Kerry's office.
Varun, welcome. It's terrific to have you on our program. And really look forward to getting your insights into some of the questions. So Varun, on to the first question. Indian Prime Minister Modi has, as you know, announced fairly ambitious targets for non-fossil fuel-based power generation of 500 gigawatts by 2030. And he made this announcement in Glasgow last week. We also know that Secretary Kerry has offered support in helping India reach the clean energy generation target. What, according to you, could be the areas of convergence for collaboration amongst both the countries?
It was very exciting to hear Prime Minister Modi's speech here at Glasgow at COP26. And he's been giving very ambitious targets for India, not just at COP26, but for years. In 2019, for example, he announced the 450 gigawatt target for renewable energy, which is, as we understand, roughly consistent with this new target for 500 gigawatts of non-fossil fuel capacity by 2030. And President Biden and Secretary Kerry are fully supportive of India's push to achieve this renewable and clean energy target. At the beginning of the year, President Biden and Prime Minister Modi announced the Agenda 2030 partnership between the US and India to achieve these climate and clean energy goals. It's so important that at the presidential and prime minister level, this is now one of the core pillars of the US-India relationship. And Secretary Kerry thereafter has traveled more than once to India to launch major tracks of this partnership. I think there are a few major areas of convergence, as you asked. The first is we want to mobilize finance to support our close partner, India, in achieving these impressive goals. The second is technology. India and the United States, for example, have already launched a national hydrogen or a joint US-India hydrogen task force to invest in the technologies of the future. Clean hydrogen, as you know, is important as we decarbonize not just the power sector, but also some of these harder to abate sectors like industry and long distance transportation. And third, we're going to collaborate on adaptation. It's so important to help India measure, manage, and adapt to the effects of climate change we're already seeing. So that's how we're thinking about our relationship with India over the last year and going forward for this critical decade.
So let me dive a little bit into a couple of things that you mentioned, which are actually very critical for the energy transition. First of all, green hydrogen. How important do you see that as being a driver of the energy transition going forward? When do you think it might become viable? And what do you see as being the future of green hydrogen in a country like India?
Well, look, I think around the world, there's this growing recognition that hydrogen is going to be critical to a net zero transition by 2050, net zero emissions globally, which, by the way, is what we need in order to keep the 1.5C target alive. And the reason is that, as we know, wind and solar power are already competitive, in fact, in 75% of the world by GDP. But they can only help us decarbonize certain parts of the economy, the parts of the economy that today use electricity. There are other parts of the economy heavy industry, for example, aviation, shipping, cement, steel, etc. These sectors of the economy can't currently use mostly power or any power. And therefore, we need molecules and not just electrons to decarbonize them. Hydrogen comes in as this remarkable fuel, an energy carrier, we call it, that can be used to decarbonize these hard to abate sectors. Green hydrogen is going to be cost competitive. I tell you this because the United States just launched our hydrogen shot, Earth shot. It's kind of like a moon shot back from the 60s, but this time around, we're focused on a series of Earth shots on major technologies, and hydrogen was the first one to bring its cost down to $1 per kilogram by 2030 and making it more competitive than fossil fuels. India could be one of the countries that has the cheapest cost of production for green hydrogen because India is well endowed with sunlight, for example. As you well know, Sumant is a leading solar and wind company in the country. And so therefore, India has this potential to be a green hydrogen hub and a hub to decarbonize these heavy industries like steel and petrochemicals. Now, by the end of 2050, when we get to net zero emissions, we're going to have to depend on hydrogen for between 15 and 20% of our final energy needs. But it's important not to forget that electrification is the primary means of decarbonizing the economy. 68% of final energy use must come from electrification because that's the cheapest, best way for us to reach a clean energy future, both through electrifying today's energy needs, using clean solar and wind, but also doing as much electrification of buildings, transportation, and power as possible.
What in your view are the other things that India can do to attract further investments?
India has demonstrated that it's a leader internationally. It's a model for emerging economies to look at and say, well, they got to 100 gigawatts and they're setting out a 450 gigawatt target. How can we do it too? You know, I'm pleased to say that Secretary Kerry and Minister Yadav of India just signed the International Solar Alliance Framework Agreement. I should correct myself. Secretary Kerry just signed the International Solar Alliance Framework Agreement. The United States looks forward to being a member. And that's very exciting because India, through the International Solar Alliance, is demonstrating its leadership around the world to help other countries, particularly countries that are developing countries, to follow that model. And through a series of policy innovations, India has put itself on the forefront. There was most recently a set of new auctions to support round-the-clock power. That, you know, one of which ReNew Power was the inaugural developer to produce that round-the-clock 24/7 power using energy storage in addition to solar and wind. To your question about what India needs to do to further attract investments, I think it's twofold. First, it's really critical that investors who invest in India, whether domestic or international, they need to feel like their investments are safe, that they will get paid on time, and that ultimately the off-takers for that power have, you know, make a credible assurance that the power purchase agreement that they're paying for is creditworthy. Second, I think it's critical for India to continue to invest in infrastructure. It'll take grid infrastructure, for example, flexibility infrastructure, including storage, to make sure that as India reaches an ever higher amount of renewable energy, that penetration is balanced by the capacity for the grid to absorb the new clean energy. And then, of course, here in the United States, we're eager to marshal our technical expertise from our 17 national laboratories, from our utilities around the country that are experiencing increasing penetrations to support our partner, India. There's a range of technical issues, the operation of a grid at high penetrations and low inertia, the regulations and market rules to enable increased amounts of trading and market. You know, in some cases, we're already seeing merchant risk being taken in India, and that's a trend we've seen for years now in the United States. So there's a range of lessons that I think that the United States can be very helpful in sharing as we go forward in our collaboration. That's what I think would help investors to continue to gain confidence and therefore reduce the cost of capital for building projects in India.
I think it's very important for India to deregulate our power markets, which, as you know, are mostly on the distribution side, run by state-owned utilities, which are really not investing in the consumer-facing infrastructure as they need to. And if they don't do that, if they don't invest in smart meters, into digital methods of managing the grid and getting into demand management systems and so on, we're going to have a situation where eventually the amount of renewables that you can inject into the grid easily will actually get capped. And so therefore, it's very important for us and for the government, in fact, in India to pass the Electricity Act, which contemplates the deregulation of the distribution utility sector. I think that's one of the big unreformed areas of the Indian economy. And given the massive role of electrification in the system in the future, in the energy systems, it's very important for us to have a well-functioning, efficient electricity sector in general. So let me stop here, Varun. Thank you so much for giving us very precise answers and very insightful answers. And thank you so much for spending time with us. Look forward to meeting you again physically in the near future. Thank you.
I really look forward to it.
Thank you, Mr. Sinha and Mr. Sivaram, for that insightful discussion and that thought-provoking discussion on this inaugural episode of ReNew Power Presents Pathway to a Fossil-Free India, partnered by ET Now. Thank you so much for watching.